Okay. So hello everybody. Welcome to week 18 of Biblical Interpretations. I hope you're doing well. As is tradition, my name is James. I'm a husband, a father, and I own an automotive business. I have a degree in Biblical and Theological Studies and Ancient Near Eastern History, although I'm not an expert in anything. We started this class back in October to discuss a specific epistemological and hermeneutic framework that I've developed over the course of my life. We spent the first 8 weeks building a foundational paradigm so that I could say the following sentence and hope that it makes sense. So, the revelation of God is inherently contradictory. The biblical text describes a God defined beyond all knowledge that also wants to be known. The moment the knowledge of God transcends the boundary between what is not known to what is known, that God no longer is transcendent, but rather continuous and becomes defined by what is known. And so, this is the fundamental concern of the biblical text. How can humanity know God without God being entirely defined by all that is known? This is the fundamental issue we are seeking an answer to. Another way to think of it is like this. How can God be known as this without becoming known as something like this? And so we have mapped the land in between, and we read and mapped nearly the entire book of Genesis, and we left the family of Terah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Egypt. And last week we started our discussion about intangible heritage and oral tradition. I threatened to lock the door and keep everyone in the room until we had read and mapped the entire biblical text in one sitting. Obviously, I didn't actually mean that because we did all go home last week. But I brought the idea up to demonstrate the idea that what you define the Bible as will directly relate to how much of it you believe you need to read. And ironically, that will directly relate to the physiological capacity you have to read it, and even your direct accessibility to the text itself. So we discussed a few different versions of the text. I mostly use the Bible in software form for this class. It is super accessible to me. I can look up whatever I want pretty quickly. I can have it in front of me pretty much any time. But we also discussed different beliefs. We also discussed that different beliefs will yield different texts. For example, there is no New Testament in Judaism because the Old Testament is not old. And is instead called the Tanakh. Or such as Catholicism, for example, which has more books in their texts than what Protestant Christians typically have in their texts. We then discussed the history of the different mediums of communicative forms. Today we are in the digital age. Lots of information, super accessible at any time. Previously we had the print age, then handmade codices, then scrolls, then stone, and then oral tradition. And so what we see is a spectrum where as time goes on, the medium of communication evolves. Information gets more dense, we can fit more information into smaller and smaller objects. And as this process happens, the practicality and accessibility to these forms of communication increases. And so I want to make clear the purpose of this thought exercise we did last week. If we combine these two concepts together, we can rationalize, as you go back in time, the physiological capacity of making, creating, crafting, writing, and reading of any given text directly corresponds to the practicality and accessibility of a given text. And it is logical to conclude the amount and length of the text itself corresponds to the medium it is on. What do I mean by this? Well, I'll give two examples. If I were to write a text that was going to go on stone, the actual amount of words I write and the words I choose to write and prioritize might be different than the amount of words I write and the words I choose to write if I know the medium of communication is digital. It is very easy to write 1,000 words in a Word document on a computer. It is very difficult to write 1,000 words on a stone. So if I was going to write the same text for both objects, I might be forced to adjust the words I use to explain my ideas in stone. So the ideas in stone might have to summarize more of the idea I'm communicating than the same idea if I were to write it in digital format instead. The medium itself determines the amount of information it can contain. So for example, scrolls can only be so big physically. They can only be so big and still exist. The medium itself has a physical capacity limiting for the amount of information that can go on it due to its size. Some scholars suggest that the very reason the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy have traditionally been combined together into one common book called the Torah is because the total length of all those books together is pretty close to the physical size a scroll can be and still be functional. Imagine a stone with every word of the Tanakh carved into it. Let's say hypothetically this stone existed. How big would it need to be? It'd be much bigger than the Mesha stele. You can't carry this in your pocket, can you? No? The medium itself determines the amount of information it can contain and the accessibility to it. So if a single stone existed that could contain every word of the Tanakh on it, it wouldn't be very accessible, would it? You would have to go to its location to read instead of bringing it to you or bringing it with you, right? Or how about if every word of the Tanakh was combined into one single scroll? Imagine all these scrolls put into one single scroll. Do you think you could lift it? Do you think you could even functionally open it? Could you travel with it? Or maybe you write the words as small as physically possible in order to make it all fit onto something that is functional. But then maybe you can't read it because the words are too small. Maybe you end up creating a scroll where only people with certain levels of eyesight can read it because the font is so small. So what about a digital format? What's the limitation to the amount of information you could contain in a digital format? Now, we could go down a rabbit hole and nerd out over the history of computers and storage, but I'll spare you the history of what is one of the coolest ideas humans have ever come up with. Let's just say it is probably limitless in all practicality. I could easily spend every second of the rest of my life writing in a digital format and not exhaust the capacity restraints available to me in communicating through digital formats. For example, here is a screenshot of the YouTube playlist for this very class. We are currently on week 18. There are 17 videos uploaded to YouTube, roughly 19 hours of content. Even though I have unlimited restraints in what I can communicate utilizing a digital medium, the point being these 17, soon to be 18 videos are nowhere near comprehensive of what I could say about the very topics we are discussing. All of it is a summary of what is in my head. I've been thinking about these matters for 15 years. There is simply no circumstance where I could possibly communicate through any medium all that I could possibly communicate, what I could possibly think, that ultimately becomes the content of this class. For example, when I am trying to communicate to people, I tend to overly rationalize and overly repeat concepts because I'm trying to hope there is a chance that what I say makes sense because I don't believe I actually communicate the best. I think in paradigms, and because these frameworks we've been discussing for some time are also how my brain literally functions, there is no end to the number of examples I can use to try to communicate my point. In fact, I am doing this literally right now. I probably didn't need to show you this slide of the YouTube videos in order to make the point I'm trying to make. But I'm trying to show you how exhaustive the paradigm can be when thinking about what is the boundary of the medium of digital content and how does it affect the summation of intangible thoughts into a tangible communicative form. If I didn't do this, this class would be half as long. I'm terrible at that specific skill. And to argue my point even farther, in another probably totally unnecessary way, really what I am talking about right now is actually to help argue farther the point about the paradigm of epistemology from sessions 2 and 3. You might think what I am talking about right now is about what we are talking about right now, and it is. But it is also me trying to explain further and expand upon the epistemological framework I laid out in sessions 2 and 3. I'm simultaneously attempting to communicate two things at once right now, but unless you were inside my brain, or unless I knew without question I was communicating perfectly what I mean, I can't assume anyone would reasonably understand that the words I am saying right now mean one thing, but also are talking about another thing. So I overly quantify and overly qualify my thoughts, which, that reminds me, real quick, speaking about the limitations of communication via digital capacity, I recommend visiting the website libraryofbabel.info. I won't explain why, because that would be me continuing to rationalize my paradigm. But I will say, if you explore that website, you might understand what I am thinking about in my head while I write these words. While I wrote these words earlier this week, that I am now speaking to you, and that some people might be watching on YouTube at some point in the future. So, do you all see the hermeneutic issues I just created in trying to bridge the gap between the intangibles in my brain to the tangible words I'm writing and now speaking? Blah. And oh my God, I just did it again. So, yeah, I'm done. Moving on. And so, regardless of the medium, the content is a tangible manifestation of the summation of something intangible in my head. What is written isn't all that could be communicated. And also, what's communicated might not be what I mean. And as you go back in time, back across mediums, the words themselves can become more dense in meaning. But what does not change is the intangible or tradition that does not get written down. And so I want to spend some time discussing these concepts: tangible, intangible, and oral tradition. I said it last week, but I want to emphasize this even more. My wife, Rebecca, is the one who provided me with the language to describe these concepts. As far as I can tell, she is the first person to use the terms tangible and intangible in tandem for describing the gap between our physical reality and our cognitive function. Last year, she actually hosted a conference where people from all sorts of disciplines contributed towards this framework. I found the work she does in architecture and religious thought to be extremely helpful in describing the paradigm pertaining to the core issues of epistemology and hermeneutics that this class is about. The use of these words together is brilliant, and there are no better words to describe it, in my opinion. So, what is tangible? What is intangible? Last week, we discussed the Mesha stele. This is a tangible physical object. It is called a stele because that word literally describes what it is, that being a standing stone. It has words on it. The words themselves are tangible. We can use scientific methods to extrapolate all sorts of data from the tangibles. What type of stone is it? Where perhaps was it quarried? Where was the object located? What do we know about that location? What language is it? Is it a language we know? What does it say? Intangibles are all the things that factor into this object that can't be known by the object itself. For example, why was it made out of stone and not something else? Or who made it? Who crafted it? Or all the hermeneutic issues we can think of, such as why does it say what it says? What is the meaning? These are all examples of intangibles that a physical object may or may not tell you. Some of these things we can use scientific inquiry to come up with reasonable, logical, realistic, likely answers to. For example, the opening text of the Mesha stele says, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab the Dibonite. My father ruled over Moab for 30 years, and I ruled after my father. I made this high place for Chemosh and Kirho, a high place of salvation, because he saved me from all predators, and because he made me triumph over all my enemies. So in this case, the object itself tells us who wrote it. But can we actually know that? Maybe King Mesha didn't actually write these words. Maybe somebody else wrote them in his name. So we may reasonably believe to know the author, but we can't objectively know the author. But even if we assume King Mesha wrote these words, it is far less reasonable he actually carved those words into this object himself. He probably had a scribe or someone whose trade or craft was the carving of words into stone actually write the words into stone. So even if King Mesha authored the words, we can't actually know who physically wrote them. These are examples of intangible data that we might reasonably conclude, but we can't actually certainly know because they are intangibles. Now, some objects, this information can be known about. So why the medium is what it is, or who the author is, or who crafted an object, sometimes those things are not intangible, but actually are tangible points of data about a thing. So maybe we can move these categories over to the tangible column for some objects. So why does it say what it says? That's what remains. Can we reasonably trust and assume that what it says is what it means, and that tells us why it was written or why it was made? This is fundamentally a hermeneutic issue. Maybe we can know this just from pure interpretation of the object itself. Maybe an object literally tells us exactly this information. So in some instances, we move this to the tangible column. So depending on the thing, sometimes these things might fall into different categories. So the question actually is, what are the intangibles of a physical thing that are always intangibles, regardless of the thing? A very obvious one is, what doesn't it say that its author might have said otherwise? This is an intangible concept pertaining to the object, and the object itself can never allow us to know the answer to. This is oral tradition. Now let's pick a different object. We have this thing, and of all the tangible things that could possibly be known and scientifically explored about this thing, no tangible data was going to allow us to know what it is. So what we learned is the use of an object can be the quintessential law of identity's semantic definition of what the object is. And so we know this is a footbath only because of its continued use as a footbath over time. If its use had stopped at some point in time, we wouldn't have any reasonable reason to think we know what it is. But use is intangible. No amount of digging in the dirt will ever tell you what the use of this object is. So now I'm going to show you some pictures of examples of tangible manifestations of intangible cognitions. I strongly recommend visiting UNESCO.org. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Understand what UNESCO is and look through their content. Maybe some of us here have been to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, or maybe you've heard of some of them. This is a map of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Yellowstone National Park, I believe, is the closest UNESCO World Heritage Site to us in Minnesota. Some UNESCO sites are very obvious, very well known. The yellow dots in this map are all human cultural objects. The green dots are natural objects, which, by the way, nature is also a form of tangible object. The red dots are sites that are endangered of being lost to history. Now, I want to make clear, this is in no way representative of what all could or should be on this list. Notice how many locations there are in Europe compared to elsewhere. Why? Because the ideas themselves of an organization like UNESCO, the idea themselves an organization like UNESCO engages with, started in Europe, usually with churches. So as you go back in time in the history of the designation of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, you in some ways will also see the evolution of the theory of tangible object preservation, where these ideas began academically. Also, racism is a huge issue, which again, this is all touching on some of the work that my wife does. But let's continue. Here are the UNESCO sites of Great Britain. We see Westminster Abbey is a UNESCO heritage site. Kew Gardens is a UNESCO site, which if this building looks familiar to you, it should, because this design heavily influenced the young architect who worked at Kew Gardens. His name was Frederick Nussbaumer. He loved Kew Gardens, and when he moved to Minnesota, he had a dream to build a similar structure in St. Paul. And he built the Como Park Conservatory. How cool is that? Right here in Minnesota, we have one of the only remaining glass dome Victorian style conservatories in the US that was directly influenced by Kew Gardens. So even if you can't go to London to see Kew Gardens, try and go to Como Park and you can step into the traditions of the architecture and design of places far away. But back to the UK. We also see probably my favorite site that I've been to in London, that being Greenwich. And oh, I get so excited seeing this picture. I won't bore you with the details, but the history of Greenwich affects your life in intangible ways every single day. If anyone is interested, you can ask me some other time and I'll happily tell you all about it. Notice these are all buildings or complexes and gardens. Here is another UNESCO site in the UK, probably the most famous, that being Stonehenge. So here's a picture of me and my son at Stonehenge having the time of our lives. What does Stonehenge look like to you? It looks similar, doesn't it? Stelae are a universal human experience. So for Joe, this one is for you. Here's the only UNESCO site in Puerto Rico. And so I apologize in advance because I cannot pronounce this properly. And one thing you'll notice throughout this class is how terrible I am at pronunciation in English, much less Hebrew or Greek or Latin or Spanish. But this is La Fortaleza in San Juan National Historic Site. So notice, Joe, notice how this is a European military fortress. Maybe, Joe, you're thinking, really? Of all the places in Puerto Rico that could be preserved, they picked the European site. And again, this is the issue with where preservation as a field has been. Very European focused. And there is an ongoing movement to diversify and acknowledge tangible objects of non-European descent. It's unfortunate that it's become so politicized because these are what the applications of ideas like critical race theory attempt to bring attention to. Hey, maybe there's more to Puerto Rico heritage than what the Europeans did. Here's the UNESCO sites of the Levant. A lot of these are places we've discussed or have even read about in Genesis. There are obvious sites, such as the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, or this one, which is just labeled as Biblical Tells Megiddo, Hatzor, Beersheba, which after weeks of reading Genesis and doing our maps, hopefully you can understand why these three places are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They've been a part of the story of humanity for thousands and thousands of years. Or this one here, this is Petra. Or this one, which might be my most favorite place I've ever been to on Earth, Wadi Rum, which I don't have words for. We'll probably talk about this place at some point. Okay, so there are some brief examples of UNESCO heritage sites. Again, I strongly, strongly, strongly implore everyone, go to UNESCO's site and just have fun with the map. Look at the diversity of humanity and our lived experience. It is absolutely incredible. So here's the question. All of these places, what are they? Are they tangible or intangible? That's right, they are all tangibles. They're all places you can take a photo of, places you can go to, touch, feel. It doesn't matter if it's an object made by human hands or a place of nature like Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, or Wadi Rum. They are all tangible objects. So all of these places go in our left column under tangible. What about the right? In 2003, UNESCO started doing the same work they do for places of heritage and started applying the same frameworks to the preservation of intangible heritage. So same thing, go to the UNESCO site and you can find this. Here we have, which under my framework of thought, I would consider to be an epistemology chart that is mapping the concepts of intangible heritage that have so far been listed under UNESCO. This chart is amazing. It's really incredible. There is so much knowledge that can be learned just on this one website. Let's just engage with some of these for a moment. So I arbitrarily picked this bubble right here. And if we click on it, it shows this. This is the category of intangible heritage called food preparation. So, okay. Now, when we click on that, we see a bunch of other bubbles that fall from it and connect to other concepts and practices. So, for example, where food preparation and music meets, we get this. And I cannot pronounce this. It's Vietnamese. And I don't know what it is. So if we click on this, then we can learn something. So V and Giam songs are sung by a wide range of communities in Vietnam. Specific songs are sung without instruments while people cultivate rice in fields. So this is an example of intangible cultural heritage. It is under the category of food preparation and music. You might archaeologically or scientifically come across the tangible object of a rice field, but you will never know what this practice is unless someone teaches it and communicates it generationally via oral tradition. What I love about what UNESCO is doing is there is this YouTube video under this category. It's 10 minutes long, and it literally is interviews and videos teaching and preserving the intangible heritage in a tangible medium. And this allows us to learn. And my epistemological bubble then expands. So let's go back to food preparation. We will come to one of my favorite intangible heritages. So we come to artisanal know-how and culture of baguette bread. And oh God, thank God that baguette bread is being preserved, because I do not want to live in a world without baguette. God forbid. Can you imagine how pathetic and void of life and all things good we would be without baguette bread? This is under the category of food preparation, handicrafts, technical skills, and apprenticeship. Why? Because it is not easy to make. You can't just decide tomorrow to make a baguette and expect it to be the same thing as someone who has been making it their entire lives, who was taught how to make it by their mom, who learned from her mom, who learned from her mom, and so on and so forth. If you want great baguette, it is a craft that needs to be taught. I remember shortly after me and Rebecca were married, she actually applied for a job at a French bakery. We had no idea what she was in for in applying for this job. Becca loves cooking and baking. So I drop her off at the job interview, and I wait in the car, and she gets done with the interview, and she comes out, and she's very upset, and she says, she just kept saying I ruined it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She just kept saying I ruined it. Ruined what? The baguette. Needless to say, Becca did not get hired making baguettes at the French bakery. Now, in her defense, Becca absolutely can follow a recipe and make baguette. But that is not the same thing as the intangible craftsmanship of making a baguette that can only be learned via oral tradition, which if you go watch the YouTube video under this category, the video itself is in French. And I would bet my life there was a difference between the craftsmanship outcome of a baguette made at the hands of a person who speaks French versus someone who doesn't. This is intangible heritage. You aren't going to find this knowledge in the ground. We might archaeologically find the tools that were used to make baguette, but we wouldn't know what they were unless the tradition is passed down. And even then, we certainly won't know how to use them without being taught via oral tradition. Now, this map can be mapped or expressed in different ways depending on the semantical emphasis desired. On the same website, they have a version that tries to connect these intangibles to their tangible places while still trying to express their overlaps. So, like this. The outer ring are places. The innermost rings are the categories or domains, is the word they use. Craftsmanship, oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, knowledge of nature. What I find interesting when thinking about this format is even as data points are continuing to be added, the outer ring of the places will not expand. So all the information that is added gets compressed into the outer ring. In other words, this chart is the same thing as the epistemological chart I showed in sessions 2 and 3 in the compression of human knowledge. And so here we are. Just using UNESCO, I hope you have a sense of what I am after with all of this. There are only so many places. Place is tangible. Tangible objects can exist in place. But these things are manifestations of intangibles. Shechem is the physical manifestation of the intangible experience described and repeated generationally in the book of Genesis. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So what bridges between the tangible and the intangible? The baguette is a physical manifestation of an intangible thought. The actions of making the baguette are physical manifestations of the intangible thought. If the action of making baguette stops, the physical object ceases to exist. However, that is not necessarily true the other way around. Now, maybe an archaeologist discovers a preserved baguette in the ground, but there's no way of knowing how to make it unless it is taught. But it is entirely possible to know how to make baguette without making one. So there are only two things that can bridge between tangible manifestations of intangible cognitions. And to me, they are actually the same thing. That being actions or use in teaching or oral tradition. We all have this, all of us, whether we know it or not, whether we realize it or not. UNESCO is nowhere near an exhaustive list, not even close. In fact, our lived experience every single day is your own version of these issues of tangible actions and intangible thoughts that you have every second. You have your own entire oral tradition about yourself. Here is a small snippet of a very, very, very poor attempt of a tangible expression of my intangible thoughts and actions. Here is a heat map of all the places I've taken photos over the past 10 years. Over 60,000 photos. And every one of them I can look at and recall and remember all sorts of intangible things that I wouldn't have words or all the capacity of the digital realm to communicate. However, even if I tried to, whether I write it down or I speak it, that oral tradition is a filter attempting to cross the gap between the tangibles and the intangibles. Also, I've never been to Mongolia. That one photo is a glitch in my Google Photos app. You also notice there isn't anything in the Middle East on this map, and that's because I didn't have a smartphone when I lived in Jerusalem. So none of my experiences there are on this map. The places I've been to mean so much to me. I think about a lot of the intangible heritage that is Minnesota or America. Sometimes it makes me sad. I have deep sorrow in my soul over what I tend to see as a suppression of intangible heritage in America. We barely had any to begin with, and we try to take it from those who do, and we don't appreciate those in which we do have. It makes me sad. Settler heritage in Minnesota is interesting in terms of heritage. For example, one of the cultural heritages of Minnesotans is calling the game Duck Duck Grey Duck. Everywhere else in the world, everyone calls it Duck Duck Goose. Only Minnesotans call it Duck Duck Grey Duck. If you go anywhere in the world and ask people in any language what they call the game Duck Duck Goose, two things are true. One, Almost everyone will know what you are talking about in some capacity, either by the words of the title of the game or by playing the game. And two, if you use the word Grey Duck, if the use of the word Grey Duck is involved in the name of Duck Duck Goose, there is some intangible connection to Minnesota in its past. This is bizarre cultural heritage, but I'll take it. Now, one of my all-time favorite intangible heritages of Minnesota is hockey. Like, I don't have words. Hockey is like a religious experience to me. I'm joking, kind of. I believe these issues are, for me, why the tangible outcome of my spiritual beliefs yields itself to entrepreneurship. Because of my experience, and I've yet to have ever talked to anyone where this is not true, the main manifestation of this issue in our world today is experienced the most in the gaps of people's workplace. There are vast, huge chasms between the tangibles and the intangibles in job descriptions. You would not believe how much content towards business ownership is all about write it down, write it down, write it down, write your process down, write your goals down, write your budget out. Make the intangible thing that is the core essence and quintessential identity of what your business is tangible, so that your employees can know what those things are and how those affect the why they were hired in the first place. There is a huge difference between small businesses that have well-defined operating procedures of someone's job descriptions versus a business that doesn't. In the end, it's the consumer experience that receives the blunt result of this gap. Entrepreneurship and business ownership, to me, is mostly concerned with bridging the gap between the tangibles and the intangibles of why that business exists and what it does. If you work at a bad job, I would bet my life it would not take long to find a source of causation for bad employment, because there is a significant gap between the intangibles the business or the owner or the manager is not communicating compared to the tangibles of the actions being done day in and day out. So now we come back to our foot bath. I hope all of this makes sense to everyone. I really hope this framework makes sense. I hope it is very clear to you the paradigm of thought I'm trying to communicate to you. The footbath is known to be a footbath, not because the tangible artifact was dug in the ground and found to be a footbath, but rather because the intangible use of the object over time is what allows us to know it was a footbath. Archaeology and scientific inquiry has nothing to do with the intangible use of the object. Or archaeology and scientific inquiry has nothing to do with it. Yes, that's what I meant. It's an epistemology issue. So now in the past, when I have hypothetically responded to my own criticisms in my mind about this matter, I've responded to my own self, saying to myself, well, weren't the archaeologists' observation of the footbath's continued use a form of scientific inquiry in and of itself? And yes, that is true. The observation of the use is a scientific methodology. And aside from the fact that that is the field of anthropology, not the field of archaeology, as archaeology proper is not anthropology, they do need to be cross-disciplinary. But aside from that, the point being, the preservation and the epistemological knowledge of the use is not possible to scientifically discover. This is what I meant last week in the Q&A when I poorly said science can't prove anything. What I meant is science cannot prove intangible cognition. This is the difference between archaeology, anthropology, and epistemology, which to me seems to be a concept very scientifically minded people and academics and dogmatic religious scholars and pastors can seem to forget. Is the continued use of the footbath passed down through teaching and oral tradition over generations that allows us to know what it is. The observation of the tangible of that effect is what anthropology is, but the knowledge of that is an epistemological matter, not a scientific matter. Why? Because without observation of the use, what the object is would never be known. And that, at worst, is what might only remain for scientific inquiry. But it is entirely possible to know of the existence of some things used via oral tradition without any observation, which is an epistemological matter, not a scientific matter. So now you ask, what does any of this have to do with anything? Well, does this framework remind you of anything else we have already discussed? Where else do we see this same epistemological binary? If we go all the way back to session 4, we discussed the theological concept of special revelation. And I hope in seeing this chart that you understand the issue of special revelation. That the issue of special revelation is the same issue as this. These are the same things. What bridges the gap between intangible and tangible? Actions and use, teaching and oral tradition. What, if anything, bridges the gap between the intangibles beyond the boundary of human knowledge and the tangibles of what humans know? I hope some of you had a light bulb go off in your head. So let's go back to the very issue that started this entire conversation last week. We can't sit here and read all of Exodus. As much as I would like to, I just can't right now. So to move forward, I have to do something I don't want to do, that being cherry pick texts for my own use. I acknowledge I'm doing this. I acknowledge that I have to. By the time we are done with our journey, you'll perhaps understand why this is a problem for me. And I hope you can understand. I am not an expert. I might very well be wrong. But this is what I think. And so I'm about to do to you the very thing I just spent 2 weeks describing to you what we all have to do. This text is not the totality of all that could have been written had the medium of communication been different. My thoughts I am expressing to you are not the totality of all I could say or write about the text, even with a medium of communication that is different than the original medium of the text. And so I am being dogmatic about my beliefs, because I have to be. And my defense to my self-preservation is, so is everyone else, because everyone must be. And so let's jump into Exodus. But we're not going to start where I would like. We are going to start after the story of the Exodus. I'm skipping so much crucial and essential content because we don't have time. And so I'm doing to you now the very thing all others do, summarizing the text in my own voice. And we read in Exodus 19. And the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, and on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain. While Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, All that the Lord had spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, Go to the people, and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, Take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, Be ready for the third day, do not go near a woman. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain in a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand on the foot of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down to Mount Sinai, to the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests come near to the Lord, consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, Set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And so, if we take out map number 1, we left everyone in Egypt at the end of Genesis. We have skipped over the enslavement of the sons of Jacob. We've skipped over the birth of Moses. We've skipped over the plagues of the Exodus. We skipped the crossing of the sea, etc. And we see in Exodus 19 this journey where they arrive at a mountain. Now it says in Exodus 13:17, When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. And so, hopefully, you now understand what this verse means because you understand the trade routes. If they are in Goshen or Pithom on our map, they do not go the northern route. They don't take the Via Maris, which is the route we have traced so far on our maps. Instead, they go south from Pithom and cross the Red Sea, probably on the northern side of the Gulf of Suez. Then they head south into the wilderness of Sinai, down to Yabal Musa, like this. Now, in Exodus 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai. This is one of those instances where scientifically there's no way of actually knowing where Mount Sinai is. However, the longest standing oral tradition of what is Mount Sinai puts it here, at Jabal Musa, which is Arabic for Mountain of Moses. There was a monastery at the bottom of the traditional site of Mount Sinai called St. Catherine's Monastery, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is one of the most important places for the preservation of ancient early Christianity. Last week when I mentioned Codex Sinaiticus, that was found in the archives of St. Kate's. I know the earliest iconographies of Christ are also at St. Kate's. This region is objectively as ancient of a sacred site as they come. So Exodus 19, likely based on oral tradition, happens here. This is a picture from the top of the traditional site of Mount Sinai. So the people assemble at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and God says to Moses, Hey, come up here, I need to talk to you. And we see in Exodus 19, Moses goes up. God talks to Moses. Then Moses goes down. Moses talks to the people. Then Moses goes back up and talks to God. Then Moses goes back down and talks to the people. But what is God telling Moses to tell the people? Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, so the people may hear me when I speak to you. Prepare yourselves. And so we have God descend on top of Mount Sinai in fire. And Moses, who I have here in green, and Aaron, who I have here in dark blue, and the priests, who I have in light blue, and the people, who are everyone else, they're at the bottom of the mountain. And only Moses and Aaron can cross the threshold that is the mountain and not the mountain. Only Moses and Aaron can transcend between the epistemological boundary, between the knowledge of the presence of God and the non-knowledge of the presence of God. But at the end of Exodus 19, everyone is at the bottom of Mount Sinai. The people cannot see the presence of God, but they can hear the voice of God. And so we read Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. They stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And so, the voice of God transcends the epistemological gap, and the people hear the voice of God. And what happens to me is the saddest moment in the Tanakh. The first time since Eden, God transcends the epistemological gap between the knowledge and the non-knowledge of God. So this is Eden 2.0. Humanity, Adam, rejects the knowledge of God and says, Speak through Moses. Do not speak directly to us, lest we die. I cannot help myself but personify God here. And imagine the rejection of making oneself known to the fullest capacity that you can, to then be rejected by what you love most. What we see develop between Genesis and Exodus is God creates and creates humanity in the presence of God in Eden. And humanity rejects God, and the epistemological divide is created. From that point in the text, God makes no attempt of making God known to creation outside of individuals who are righteous. And so, post Eden, the solution for bridging the gap begins to develop through these individuals. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Moses. God speaks to these people directly. And the culmination of all of this is at Mount Sinai. Sinai is the solution to Eden. And for the first time since Eden, God communicates directly to a plurality of humanity. And humanity says, Stop, speak to the individual. And so Moses proceeds up the mountain. In Exodus 20:22 says, And Hashem said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have spoke to you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And so the rest of Exodus 20, 21, and 23 is God speaking directly to Moses, absent the people of Israel. So then we come to Exodus 24. Then he said to Moses, Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood, and he threw it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, "Come out to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went into the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And so Moses writes down the words of the Lord. What words? I think Exodus 21 through 23. And how does he write them? I think he writes them on 12 stones. What does that remind you? Words carved into stone. Where else do we see this concept? How about like everything else we've spent the past 2 weeks discussing? And so we end class here tonight. We have finally arrived at what I believe to be the most crucial point of our entire class. Next week, we will continue at Mt.Sinai and see what happens next. So I hope you all enjoyed tonight. I appreciate your interest and willingness to listen to what I have to say. It truly does mean a lot to me. So thank you, and we'll see everybody next week.